We continue to follow Paul, who is now before Felix, the governor, and a delegation of Jews accompanied with a orator, or we could say lawyer, by the name of Tertullus, is now making their case against Paul before the governor. And that's where we're at in Acts chapter 24, verse 5. And we read there, "For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law." So Tertullus speaking here. Now Paul had actually nothing to fear from the truth. But unfortunately, the truth does not always prevail in court of law, and we know that very well today in our time, where we see so often the truth being shoved under the carpet, and lies and deception is what rules. Tertullus had flattered the governor first. We saw this last time. And now he was listing charges against Paul. Charges without any evidence. And in this verses that we just read, there are 4 quote-unquote charges. First of all, he says, "We found this man a plague," meaning he's politically dangerous. He's a rebel. He's a revolutionary. He's against the narrative, you can say. And there were many revolutionaries against Rome. And so Tertullus is trying to put Paul into that category in order to get the antipathy of the governor against Paul. As if Paul was against the Romans. Of course, this was a complete fabrication. And the second thing he mentions is, he says that Paul is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now don't confuse this with the Nazarites. We looked at this a while ago, that's something else. Nazarene is simply someone who comes from Nazareth. And Nazareth had a very poor reputation. We can read it among other places in John 1 verse 46, where Nathanael says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And so Paul allegedly is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And the sect of the Nazarenes is actually what the Christians were in a mocking way often called, because of the bad reputation of Nazareth, and of course the fact that Jesus came from Nazareth. Third allegation is he's a mover of sedition, or in other words, he is instigating riots among the Jews throughout the world, Tertullus says. Now this is actually more of a compliment than an accusation, because it meant that Paul's influence reached throughout the entire Roman Empire. So these 3 are actually not real accusations, but rather unfounded attempts of character assassination. It's a very typical thing that we often see, and we see it a lot nowadays, especially because there are certain narratives imposed by governments and powers that be, and powers that want to be. And so when you go against this narrative, you will find this kind of opposition. Character assassination. And then the last accusation is the only one that theoretically could hold something, and namely he tried to profane the temple. It's the only specific accusation or charge, but there is no evidence for it. Then Tertullus continues, but the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. So Tertullus now puts the Roman commander Lysias into bad light. Maybe in an attempt to create a competition between the two, divide and conquer. And then he says, the things of which we accuse him. And actually there was nothing. There was nothing. But the Jews, they assented. They were all in agreement about this empty set of accusations. It's very, very much, I've said it a few times already, like today, where people are convicted without evidence, where the truth doesn't matter, but opinion and politics do. People are convicted because of their beliefs, because of a negative sentiment against them. All of a sudden, without any evidence, without any flesh to it, you will get cancelled, deplatformed. It can be online, it can be in real life. We've all seen and heard of these many messages, this or that is against community guidelines. All of a sudden you have violated something without ever getting a real explanation what guidelines you have violated. And I wonder also, who is this community to begin with? Anyway, we can recognize these tactics. Now it's time for Paul to defend himself, to speak. In verse 10, then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned him to speak, answered, forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. Paul is happy to defend himself. He does not need any flattering introduction. He does not need a lying lawyer. He can speak for himself. He has all the facts and the truth on his side. 12 days had passed since he was in the temple, and they had no witness. Paul denied all the accusations, and he could say in truth there was no evidence, and there really wasn't. He continues then, verse 14, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. Now, after saying the accusations that they just put against me, there is no evidence for this, now Paul reveals the real reason why the Jews are against him. It was spiritual. The Jews call it heresy, a sect of the Nazarenes. But Paul calls it here the way. And he makes clear that he has not abandoned the God of his fathers, the same God that these Jews claim to believe in. He has not abandoned the prophets or the law, but he believes in the resurrection of the just and the unjust. He mentions both. And of course this was based on the resurrection of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. So basically in 2 sentences Paul has laid out the whole essence of Christianity. He speaks about God, the law and the prophets. And then he speaks about the way, which is Jesus, and the resurrection, of which Jesus is the first fruits, the resurrection of the just, the first resurrection, unto salvation, and the resurrection of the unjust. This is the second resurrection, the resurrection of the unjust for judgment. So the whole thing is there in a nutshell. And this is the problem. This is the problem for the Jews. They don't want to accept this. They don't want to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And many of them, not the Pharisees, but the others, didn't even accept the resurrection, or resurrection in general. So Paul then continues in verse 17, "Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon many Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object, if they had aught against me." So he actually came to do something good, to bring alms. And he certainly was not a plague, not a pestilent, as they say. And then he refers to his visit in the temple, because this was actually the only accusation that had could have had some credibility. He said I was there to be purified, and not to profane, as was the accusation. He was not with a gang, he was not rioting, but he was there in all holiness. And then he adds, actually, if the accusations were true, then where are those witnesses that would have been present in the temple? If it was true, there would have been quite a few witnesses, and we are 12 days further, and they were not able to have even one witness. The case is clear, and Felix has to come to a conclusion. Verse 22, "When Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them, and said, When Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded a centurion to keep Paul, and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him." So, as I said, the case is clear. Felix knew enough. He actually could have set Paul free based on this court here. There was nothing against him. But Felix avoided a decision. He didn't want to make a decision and have all the Jews against him. And so he decides that he also wants to hear the Roman commander Lysias, who had sent Paul to him in the first place. Felix knew Paul was innocent. And this is also something we recognize often today. There are many people in politics or in law enforcement or in the judicial system that know that their decision is actually wrong, and they try to avoid decision, or they try to shift the responsibility to someone else. Felix here, he didn't want to be identified as sympathetic to the gospel or to the Christians, and so Paul was kept in custody, but he gave him the greatest possible liberty. And so what happens? Verse 24, "After certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness and temperance and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, Go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee." So this was the period after the hearing we just read about, and before that Lysias came to Caesarea. There is this time of waiting, and Felix is apparently thinking about the things that Paul said. He has seen Paul, he has seen Paul's strong faith, and he's curious. There is something about this man, and there is something about what he says. This is what the gospel should do. When we speak to people, we should provoke this curiosity, maybe even jealousy. So Felix visits Paul, and he takes his wife Drusilla with him. It says he was a Jewess, but she was the sister of King Herod Agrippa, which we will meet in the next chapter. The Herodians, they were Jews, but they were not like the Jews in Israel. They were actually from Arab ancestry, and they were forced to become Jews by the Hasmonean rulers. So there's a whole history there. They were Jews, but they were Jews in a quite different way. In any case, the Herod dynasty, they didn't have too well reputation, and neither did this Drusilla. She was a beautiful woman, and she was young. She was only 20 years old at this time, and had already been married before. And actually Felix, the Roman governor, had seduced her away from her previous husband, and she gladly accepted this, because for her this was a career move to a higher position. She was very ambitious, and this is actually what she was after. Both Felix and Drusilla were ambitious, they were greedy, and they were without morals, you can say. And so, upon inquiring to hear more about the gospel, Paul gives a sermon, and of course we don't know the full extent of it, but what we know are the three topics that he speaks about. What is mentioned here: righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. Righteousness to be found in Christ, and self-control or temperance to stick to ethics and morals. Now, Felix and Drusilla were lacking both. There was no righteousness to be found in them, and self-control there was also not. They were fully giving in to temptations that could bring them either wealth and or pleasure. So Paul spoke to their heart. They could recognize themselves in this. And the third thing Paul mentions then is the judgment to come, that there is accountability before God because of all these things. And Paul spoke apparently in a very convincing way. It was not so that Felix said, "I don't believe you." He was trembling. He was full of fear, which means he believed. He believed what Paul said, and he understood that this judgment was to be upon him as well. What we will see from this, first of all, is that Paul was no man-pleaser. He was not trying to be non-offensive so that his own position would not be endangered. He was saying plainly and boldly what it is, and it would only be more modern day preachers be as bold to authorities to just say it the way it is without any restraint, because the result is Felix was afraid, he was trembling, and that is a good thing. Anyone who is without Christ should be trembling because of what follows, the judgment that is to come. That fear, of course, should not stay there. It should move the person to accept Jesus and the gift of salvation, and to be released from this wages of sin, and thus from the judgment. It should be like this, convicting and making those that are not yet saved fearful and draw them to salvation. But Felix does something else. he says, go away. When I have a convenient season, when I feel better, when I'm ready for it, when I think it's the right time, then I will call for thee. He rejects, and he rejects through delay. There are different ways to reject the gospel. The result is, of course, always the same, but there are different ways, and we will see another way of the next ruler that Paul speaks to in the next chapter or 2 chapters down. Anyway, but this is rejection through delay. And if you've ever shared the gospel with people, this is what you often hear. It's very good, yes, I believe the words that you say, and it's great, wonderful, and I will think about it, and when I'm ready, then we will speak again, when it is my time. And Paul writes to the Corinthians, today is the day of salvation. Tomorrow may never come. And on top of that, you will never be more ready than today. You will never be more ready than later. The reason is that once you have accepted to a certain extent the truths of the gospel, but you still do not accept Jesus in your heart, you have opened the door to the gospel, and the devil doesn't like that. And so he will not leave you just hanging there until you feel that is the right time, and then you accept Jesus. He will use this time to make things worse, to make the distance between you and God bigger. And so that delay may turn into an eternity, and an eternity without God. Delay never makes things better. They go to worse. It doesn't mean that the person cannot be saved, but it's just more difficult. It's very dangerous, of course, because we don't have guarantee of tomorrow, but apart from that, it's more dangerous because the enemy does not rest in this meantime. So that's also something we should have in mind when we speak to others and they delay. They say, well, it's not my time yet. I don't feel ready for it. Have that in mind. The person will not get more ready later. So what happens now? Verse 26. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might lose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener, and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to shew the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So Felix knew Paul was innocent, and he kept him in custody. Why? He hoped to get a bribe. That someone might pay a great sum, and in exchange for Paul to be loosed. We don't hear again about that he is still waiting for the Roman commander. Years pass actually. And in these years he speaks often with Paul, but it doesn't bring him to the decision to accept Christ. So you see this rejection by delay, it doesn't bring anything. And 2 years later, then Festus comes, and Festus would be the successor of Felix. So Felix is basically at the end of his term as governor. Festus comes to visit him. He will be the next one to serve there as governor. This would be the perfect time to say to Paul, as my term ends, your captivity also ends. You're free to go. And actually, Roman law would not allow a Roman citizen like Paul was, to be in custody without being convicted for more than 2 years. So this would be also, according to the Roman law, the time to let Paul go. That's why it says here specifically after 2 years, so that we know that this is the case. But what does Felix do? He wants to pleasure the Jews, and therefore he left Paul bound. Now it's Festus' problem. Felix was willing to break even the Roman law in order to please the Jews. We see that we can see a similarity with this other governor, Pilate, before whom Jesus stood. He too wanted to please the Jews. That's why he allowed Jesus to be beaten and crucified. He too could not find any guilt in Jesus, just like this Felix could not find guilt in Paul. But they were man-pleasers. And we see also from this that this delay did not make Felix better. He was still greedy. He was probably even more greedy. He was still more serving his own position and reputation than anything else. Refusal by delay, and I've said it before, I say it again, it's not a good option, because man's heart is inclined to go from bad to worse, and Satan and his minions are fueling this all the time, of course. So if someone says, I'm not ready yet, then you can answer, you are more ready now than you will ever be. You are more ready now than you will ever be. So if you delay now, things will become more difficult, and your eternal fate is at risk more than ever. Today is the day. On top of that, God would not send this person on your path. God would not have allowed you to share the gospel with this person if this person was not ready. So if we look to these two governors, Pilate and Felix, they missed their chance. They missed the chance because they delayed, and that delay, that period of delay, turned into an eternity without God. Today is the day of salvation. It is such a solid truth that Paul writes to the Corinthians, of which we see proof over and over. And those that delay and sometimes after years, finally accept Christ, they will all agree. If only I would have said yes right from the beginning. How much misery could I have spared? How much joy could I have had? Joy in the Lord. Today is the day of salvation. Amen.